Imagine being one of the greatest military leaders of all time. You command tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers and a fearsome cavalry supported by a troop of towering, mighty war elephants. But to reach your enemy and change the course of history, you must first lead your vast army on a perilous journey across the tallest, most unforgiving mountain range in Europe, the mighty Alps. This is the incredible true story of Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who defied the odds and marched his army, elephants and all, from Spain across the Pyrenees and through the Alps in an ingenious surprise attack against the Roman Empire. In the 3rd century BC, the ancient world was dominated by two great powers locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy: the seafaring empire of Carthage and the mighty Roman Republic. For over a century, these heavyweight rivals fought a series of conflicts known as the Punic Wars for control of the Mediterranean. Carthage was a rich Phoenician city located in what is now Tunisia, with colonies stretching across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Romans rapidly expanded from their city on the Italian peninsula to forge an empire surrounding the entire inland sea. From Sicily to Hispania, modern Spain, the two powers carved up spheres of influence and clashed violently over valuable trade routes, ports, and territory. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BC over control of the island of Sicily. It lasted a grueling 23 years before the Romans finally prevailed. Under the humiliating peace terms, Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily to Rome and pay a crushing indemnity. But the hostilities reignited just a generation later in the Second Punic War. This time, the stage was set for one of the most daring and ingenious military campaigns ever undertaken. As the conflict reignited in 218 BC, the Carthaginians hatched an ambitious plan to turn the tables on Rome. Rather than confront Roman legions on their home turf in Italy, they would strike first with a surprise attack on the Italian peninsula itself, coming at the empire from an unexpected direction. Leading this bold endeavor was Hannibal Barca, one of history's most brilliant military strategists. Born in 247 BC, Hannibal grew up immersed in the ongoing conflict between Carthage and Rome. According to legend, his father Hamilcar made the young Hannibal swear an oath of eternal hatred towards Rome. Hannibal quickly demonstrated a keen strategic mind and became accustomed to hardship and military life from a young age, accompanying his father on campaigns in modern-day Spain. At 26 years old, Hannibal became the commander of Carthage's main army in Iberia after his father's death. He spent the next 2 years consolidating control and raising his army, looking for an opportunity to deal a decisive blow against Rome. His grand strategy soon took shape: to defy Roman expectations by marching a massive invasion force, complete with cavalry and war elephants, directly into the heart of Italy itself. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal put his ingenious plan into motion. He assembled a massive army at Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, Spain, numbering between 60,000 to 100,000 men, according to estimates. His forces included cavalry from North Africa and Iberia, seasoned infantry from many backgrounds, and perhaps most intimidatingly, around 36 towering Indian war elephants. With his combined arms force assembled, Hannibal began the first daunting leg of his journey, crossing the Pyrenees Mountains to reach the Roman province of Gaul, modern France. The crossing was an engineering and logistics feat, as Hannibal had to cut and prepare roads to allow the immense column of troops and supply wagons passage over the high mountain passes. Facing harassment from mountain tribes, Hannibal formed a rolling square formation for defense, with infantry ranks at the front, rear, and flanks, cavalry in the center, and the elephants in the middle protecting the baggage and supplies. In a brilliant move that would become a trademark, Hannibal used his famously cunning mind to outwit and bypass hostile tribes, rather than confronting them directly. After a punishing 3-week march, Hannibal's force exited the Pyrenees into Gaul. They had covered around 250 miles, but this was only the beginning. Ahead lay an even more formidable obstacle: the towering Alps mountains separating him from Italy. Hannibal's invasion plan hinged on one of the most audacious and ingenious military maneuvers in history. Rather than taking the long, circuitous coastal route from Spain into Italy, he aimed to catch the Romans completely off guard by crossing the Alps themselves, then descending directly into Rome's heartland in the Po Valley. But the Alpine crossing was a daunting prospect. Rugged, remote, and prone to sudden snowstorms, even in October when Hannibal began the passage, the Alpine range was an extreme test of endurance and logistics for a massive force. The exact route Hannibal took is still debated, but most historians believe he followed the valley of the Rhone River into the Alps via a pass through the modern Mount Genève region, straddling the borders of France, Italy, and Switzerland. Along the way, his army faced a myriad of challenges, from foraging for supplies in the barren mountain valleys to fierce resistance from Celtic tribes in the high passes. In one of the most famous episodes, Hannibal's forces came to a sheer cliff face, blocking their path. According to legend, Hannibal ordered immense bonfires built, and when the flames had heated the rocky face, he poured cold vinegar over it, causing the stone to crack. His engineers then completed demolishing the obstacle to make a path. It is emblematic of Hannibal's relentless ingenuity in overcoming the obstacles Mother Nature threw at him. Throughout the harrowing march, perhaps Hannibal's greatest ordeal was handling the 37 Indian war elephants that had made the journey from Iberia. In the thin alpine air, the huge beasts suffered terribly from fatigue, hunger, and the bitter cold. One by one, the mighty animals grew too weak and ill to continue and had to be abandoned along the trail. Hannibal demonstrated his leadership by dismounting from his own horse to walk alongside the surviving elephants, showing he shared their plight. His personal example kept the animals moving despite the odds. In the end, after untold hardship, and perhaps over a third of his force lost to combat, accidents, exposure, and starvation, Hannibal emerged into the welcoming plains of the Po Valley into northern Italy in late 218 BC. His army was bloodied and depleted down to 20,000 infantrymen, 6,000 cavalry, and just a handful of the original elephants. But Hannibal had achieved the impossible by crossing the Alps and stood poised to strike at the heart of the Roman Republic. No sooner had Hannibal's haggard forces reached the Po Valley than they were confronted by a large Roman army led by consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus. Based in northern Italy, the Romans had known Hannibal was active in Gaul, but they were stunned when his army suddenly emerged from the Alpine passes into Italy itself. Sempronius immediately sought to bring Hannibal's diminished force to battle before it could be reinforced. Hannibal, exhausted but defiant, agreed to engage, carefully choosing terrain near the Trebia River that favored his smaller numbers. In the late winter of 218 BC, the two armies clashed. Though outnumbered nearly 4-1, Hannibal displayed his tactical genius by first sending his light cavalry to provoke the Romans, feigning retreat until they were drawn out into deep, freezing river waters. As the sluggish and weary Romans emerged, Hannibal launched his cavalry on their flanks while his infantry hit them front on, surrounding them. It was a decisive victory. Some 25,000 Romans were killed or captured, while Hannibal lost only 4,000 men. With this stunning upset, Hannibal secured his hold in northern Italy and showed the Romans just how dangerous his small, nimble force could be when properly deployed. More decisively, the battle shattered Roman assumptions that this war could be finished off quickly. Hannibal's bold invasion was just beginning. In the wake of Trebia, the full gravity of the situation sank in for the Romans. An enemy army had invaded northern Italy for the first time since the Gallic invasions over 200 years prior, and this foe was led by one of history's most ingenious and audacious commanders, a general willing to take monumental risks to gain an advantage. Now, Hannibal's victory had allowed him to spend the winter of 217 BC securely encamped in Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, foraging supplies and allowing his men to recuperate after their grueling Alpine crossing. Additionally, he was able to enlist support from Gauls and Ligurians who resented Roman domination. By the spring, Hannibal had reinforced his army with fresh troops, cavalry, and more war elephants brought across the Alps, swelling his numbers to nearly 50,000 men and dozens of elephants once more. The Romans, stunned by their losses, scrambled to respond. In the spring of 217 BC, they gathered a new massive army of 6 legions, perhaps 80,000 men. This force was split under 2 consular armies, led by Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius. They aimed to attack Hannibal in a classic Roman envelopment using their superior numbers. However, the Carthaginian was not to be underestimated. Setting a daring trap, Hannibal lured the arrogant Flaminius into a snare first. In the Battle of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal concealed his main force in rocky terrain near the lake, allowing Flaminius's army to march into the narrow pass. With the Romans stretched out, Hannibal launched his attack. Sallying out with his heavy infantry, light troops, and dreaded elephant corps, Flaminius's army was yet again routed by Hannibal's superior tactics, with Rome suffering staggering losses, up 25,000 dead. Hannibal's forces were now free to roam and ravage central Italy, gathering supplies and stirring rebellions among Rome's subordinate allies. The Romans, left reeling by the devastating losses of Trebia and Trasimene, were thrown squarely onto the defensive in their own heartland. Once more, they elevated Rome's most respected statesman and general, Fabius Maximus, as dictator to lead the struggle against Hannibal's invasion. With the full menace of Hannibal's invasion now abundantly clear, the seasoned Fabius Maximus understood Rome needed a strategic shift in mindset. As dictator, his role was not to win the war outright, but simply prevent total disaster until the advantages of Rome's size and resources could accrue. As such, he adopted a brilliant defensive strategy that bears his name to this day, the Fabian strategy. Rather than directly engaging Hannibal in open battle, Fabius instead hunkered down in fortified cities and defensive terrain, letting his large forces shadow and monitor Hannibal's army, but refused to be baited into a pitched confrontation on unfavorable terms. At the same time, he sent out mobile columns and cavalry to harass Hannibal's foraging parties. Like a canny matador, Fabius was content to let Hannibal exhaust himself, wearing his horns out by ravaging the countryside of Lazio and Campania, which the Romans abandoned to him. Deprived of major battlefield victories, Hannibal's army was limited in its ability to gain reinforcements, while Rome's advantages in manpower reserves and logistics meant its legions could be replenished. For nearly a year in 217–216 BC, Hannibal was forced to helplessly pull on the wolf's tail as Fabius eluded him. The Carthaginian was incensed at this tactic, powerless to bring the Romans to battle or strike a decisive blow. Despite some Roman griping at their lands being abandoned to ravaging, Fabius held firm, avoiding the mistake of rashly squandering armies against Hannibal. Finally, in mid-216 BC, the impatient Fabian strategy fell out of favor and the dictator was replaced by new consuls who gave up waiting and returned to the offensive against Hannibal. This gave the Carthaginian his opening for yet another masterstroke of tactical brilliance. By 216 BC, both sides had committed their full forces and prestige to the climactic confrontation in southern Italy near the small village of Cannae. For the Romans, defeating Hannibal's army decisively was crucial to ending the invasion and restoring their honor after the losses at Trebia and Trasimene. They amassed a gargantuan force of 8 legions and allied troops, totaling around 80,000 to 90,000 men, under the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. For Hannibal, the stakes were even higher. His strategic situation was growing tenuous as years of campaigning in Italy had depleted his original Iberian forces. Without a decisive victory to re-energize the war, he risked being slowly bled by attrition from Rome's superior numbers. So at Cannae, the audacious Carthaginian general devised perhaps his most brilliant battle plan yet. Using meticulous reconnaissance, Hannibal chose flat, open ground near the village, perfectly suited for his tactical mastery. He arrayed his outnumbered army of around 50,000 men in a formidable defensive position, with his veteran Iberian and Gallic infantry bunched in a semicircular central line. On the flanks, he staggered his superb Numidian and Iberian cavalry forces in an oblique order, giving them depth to counter the superior Roman cavalry. Most brilliantly, Hannibal pulled his center line back, making his infantry appear weak but with the ground carefully scouted so that his line curved back subtly to create a natural anvil shape. All the while, he took care to place his elite Iberian and Libyan troops on the refused flanks of this anvil formation to absorb the brunt of the Roman infantry assault. The Romans, for their part, formed their heavy infantry in a massive, dense line in the traditional manner. Their cavalry formed on the wings, with Paulus commanding the more experienced troops, while the rash Varro led the allied cavalry in a bid for glory. As the battle opened, the Roman cavalry immediately attempted to outflank and overwhelm Hannibal's cavalry wings. But the Numidian light cavalry were more mobile, tying down the Romans, while Hannibal's heavier Iberian cavalry launched a concerted attack to rout first Varro's force and then Paulus's horsemen. The stage was set for Hannibal's main stratagem. Just as the Romans believed their superior numbers could simply overwhelm and flank Hannibal's center, they walked into his trap. As the Roman lines pushed into the curved center, Hannibal gave the order for his strengthened flanks of infantry to shift and wheel inward, forming an enveloping crescent shape. This trapped the extended Roman infantry into a steadily closing encirclement. As the Roman lines compressed and became stuck in their tightening perimeter, fatigue and casualties mounted. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry returned from their pursuit and charged into the Roman rear, finally sealing their doomed army into an inescapable cauldron of death and destruction. For nearly 8 hours, the brutal grinding slaughter continued unabated, as the Romans were decimated. In the end, the epic Battle of Cannae resulted in perhaps the single greatest tactical victory in ancient warfare. Roman losses were catastrophic, around 700. Infantries were killed, including most of the officer corps, along with 10,000 auxiliary troops. For Hannibal, he lost just 6,000 men in this lopsided triumph. More than that, he had shattered forever Rome's aura of invincibility and proven his status as a military genius for the ages. In the wake of Cannae, much of southern Italy joined Hannibal's cause, fueling his army with fresh manpower and supplies. The Carthaginians' grand strategy seemed poised for ultimate victory, having cut the jugular of Roman power. But even in the throes of such a colossal defeat, the Romans demonstrated their unshakable resilience and resolve to fight on, guaranteeing this Second Punic War would become an epic struggle to the bitter end. In the aftermath of the Cannae disaster, where Rome had suffered perhaps its single greatest battlefield loss ever, the Republic teetered on the brink. Panic gripped the citizenry, fueled by rumors that Hannibal's victorious army was marching on the capital itself. Legend says that in this dark hour, a single elderly senator named Fabius Buteo delivered a rousing oration that rallied the spirit of Roman perseverance despite the horrendous losses. While rival allies like Capua defected to Hannibal, Rome drew on its immense reserves of manpower, resources, and national discipline to endure. The Republic decreed that no battles be given, and that all available men be conscripted to refill shattered legions. Once again, the seasoned Fabius Maximus was called out of retirement to resume his namesake Fabian defensive strategy that had been abandoned before Cannae. Over the next few years from 215 to 211 BC, despite losing dozens of cities and half of Italy to Hannibal's control, Rome grimly hung on. Applying the Fabian strategy systematically, they avoided direct engagement while bleeding Hannibal's forces through attritional skirmishing and protecting inland towns. Meanwhile, the Romans capitalized on their wealth and the security of their Mediterranean shipping routes to project power from other fronts beyond Italy. Roman legions under commanders like Claudius Marcellus conducted small mobile campaigns to retake and secure towns still loyal to Rome across the peninsula. Most crucially, in 212 BC, the Romans finally began achieving major strategic successes, when an invasion force under Claudius Nero recaptured Syracuse from Carthaginian-held Sicily, cutting off vital granary supplies for Hannibal's armies in Italy. Back on the mainland, neither side could claim a decisive advantage. Despite capturing the city of Tarentum in 212 BC on the Italian heel, Hannibal was unable to lay siege to Rome itself. His depleted invasion force simply lacked the manpower and resources to deliver the crushing blow. And though the Romans endured horrific casualties in minor encounters like the Battle of Herdoneae, 210 BC, where another 2 legions were wiped out, their strategic position gradually improved. By 209 BC, the conquest of Syracuse allowed Rome to divert seasoned legions from Sicily to Italy to bolster the defenses. As the war entered its final years, Roman fortunes were steadily turning, but Hannibal wasn't yet bowed, despite lacking reinforcements from Carthage. The tenacity of both combatants meant the Second Punic War's conclusion would be as brutal as its opening years. Throughout the war's long slog, Hannibal's greatest weakness was his inability to reinforce his stranded invasion force from Carthaginian territories. As long as Rome controlled the seas, Hannibal could not be adequately resupplied or reinforced from Iberia or Africa. This vulnerability was thrown into stark relief when a major Carthaginian expedition aimed at relieving the Italian deadlock was utterly destroyed by Rome in 207 BC. The Battle of the Metaurus saw a large Carthaginian force being transported by sea from Iberia decisively defeated, and its commander killed before it could link up with Hannibal. The Romans, led by consul Gaius Claudius Nero, demonstrated tactical superiority in pitched battle. But the genius was their strategic foresight to intercept and destroy the reinforcements before they could pose a threat to Rome itself. From this point, Hannibal's cause was doomed, as his army wasted away in Italy with no prospect of relief. At long last, in 205 BC, the Romans took the offensive by dispatching an invasion force under Scipio to seize the initiative in Hannibal's homeland of Africa itself. This brilliant strategic reversal compelled Carthage to order their Italian invasion force recalled from its long, bloody stalemate on the peninsula. Weakened but still prideful, Hannibal was compelled to return to Africa in 203 BC to face Scipio's Roman army that had seized the fort of Utica, placing Carthage itself under threat. After years of stalemate in Italy, the war's final act shifted to the continent. The epic struggle began on. In 202 BC, the stage was set for the climactic Battle of Zama. Despite having scored so many epic victories over their legions, Hannibal's now spent invasion army was finally outnumbered and ill-equipped compared to Scipio's fresh, well-supplied forces. On the plains of Zama, near Carthage, the 2 great generals finally faced each other in one last, epic confrontation. Hannibal massed his infantry in his customary baited hook formation, but was hampered by a lack of quality cavalry to anchor the flanks against Scipio's superior mounted wings. When the battle erupted, Hannibal's final, desperate gambit was outmatched by Rome's superior training, equipment, and tactical coordination between infantry and cavalry. The Carthaginian center was steadily ground down while their flanks were overwhelmed and enveloped. Despite a heroic last stand by Hannibal's veteran mercenary troops, the battle ended in a decisive Roman victory. Having lost over 20,000 soldiers and 4,000 captured to only 2,500 Roman losses, Hannibal was finally defeated. After over 15 years of war, the Second Punic War came to a bitter end for the Carthaginian invasion forces. Under humiliating terms, Carthage was compelled to surrender all overseas territories and reduce its armies. Their dream of empire had been vanquished by Roman resolve, leaving them a third-rate power in the Mediterranean. Hannibal himself defied the calls for his head by escaping capture and spending years in exile, fomenting resistance against Rome from various kingdoms and realms. But the damage was done. Carthage's military might was forever broken in the face of Roman determination. One generation later, in 146 BC, the city itself was turned to rubble by Roman armies in the Third Punic War. Hannibal Barca's invasion of Italy was a feat perhaps never to be equaled in the boldness of its conception or brilliance of its execution. No commander before or since has duplicated leading an entire army, complete with towering war elephants over the impassable Alpine mountain range by such an unthinkable overland route. Yet in the end, the Carthaginian genius proved no match for the resilience, patriotism, and strategic resources of the Roman Republic at the height of its power. Though the Romans acknowledged their great adversary's battlefield cunning, it was an early Roman principle that prevailed, that the Romans never allow their courage to be dejected by adversity. In defeating Hannibal after years of losses and humiliation, they displayed a tenacity worthy of their subsequent title, the supreme rulers of the ancient Mediterranean world. If you enjoyed this journey through history with Hannibal Barca, imagine what more awaits. Subscribe to Stories of Legends for captivating tales of heroes, legends, and unforgettable moments from the past. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the greatest stories ever told. Don't miss out. Your next favorite legend is just a click away.